there's 2 decades of incremental steps in between, for instance, the Depository Institutions Deregulation Act in 1980 and the Commodity Futures Modernization Act in 2000.
And what about the quant movement? You're not saying that quantitative models themselves are to blame, are you?
No, and that's a great point. Quantitative models themselves weren't the problem. It was over-reliance on the models or the intentional misuse of models that caused the trouble. One view is that the quant movement caused many professionals to believe, wrongly in retrospect, that they had conquered risk using the models. More cynical view is that they used the quantitative models to justify taking outsized risk instead of for objective risk management.
And this spread of risk-taking culture, would you explain the impact of that?
Sure. The combination of the first 3 deeper causes that we just talked about, together with the high compensation levels for professionals at investment banks, caused other kinds of financial firms to want to emulate the iBanks in the 80s and 90s. They wanted to copy the high comp levels that trading floor professionals at iBanks were receiving. Tom Wolfe depicted the allure of the investment banking culture very vividly in his novel The Bonfire of the Vanities. Commercial banks and other financial firms embraced strategies for raising their comp levels that included branching into riskier activities like the ones at the investment banks.
And globalization, what role did that play?
Well, globalization was a cause of the crisis in 2 ways, really. The first was the homogenization of business practices that came with advances in computers, telecommunications, and air travel. Domestic capital markets gave way in large measure to an integrated global financial system. Professionals around the world started pursuing the same strategies more and more often. The second way that globalization was a deeper cause was through the removal of capital controls among the developed nations. The removal of capital controls happened with the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. Until then, capital controls had somewhat restrained the spread of contagion internationally. Interestingly, capital controls may be re-emerging as we're now observing with the Cyprus situation.
And what else do you think market participants and regulators need to do today in order to avoid laying the groundwork for the next financial crisis?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? So the frequency and severity of financial crises depends partly on how the financial sector is regulated. As many folks have observed, quite rightly I think, it's not just a question of how much regulation, but having the right regulation. However, where I part company with the mainstream view is on the issue of how to design optimal regulation for the U.S. financial system. In my view, an optimal regulatory framework for the U.S. relies on policymakers first coming to grips with an idea, a vision for what the role of the financial system is. There are several alternatives. Is it to promote stability? Is it to promote capital formation? Is it to make the U.S. financial sector competitive on the international landscape? Only after policymakers decide on the role of the financial system can they have any hope of crafting an optimal regulatory framework with the issue of financial crises as one of the important considerations in the design.
So do they lack that vision now? Is that what you're saying?
I haven't seen it. I see the